Hey guys, Adam here, and in this video I'm going to look at glycemic index and if it has any real world impact or implications on fat loss or overall health, or is it just complete and utter garbage? Now, glycemic index gets a lot of attention in the press, and we're often told that if you want to optimize your health and lose body fat, then you should avoid higher GI foods and only eat lower GI foods, or focus on eating lower GI foods. Now first, if you don't know what GI or glycemic index is, it's essentially a figure representing the ability of a carbohydrate food to increase blood sugar levels. It was invented about 40 years ago and is tested by consuming a specific carbohydrate source when in a fasted state. So the theory behind avoiding higher GI foods such as white bread, sugar, white potatoes, and opting for lower GI foods such as their brown whole grain counterparts goes like this. Higher GI foods equals higher levels of blood sugar, which leads to higher levels of insulin, which causes the inhibition of lipolysis. In other words, it stops the breakdown of fat or making fat. It makes sense when you look at it like this. And this is where most of the low carb zealots would argue in favor of reducing carbohydrates because of this reason. But there are a few misconceptions here. The first misconception is there's not a direct one-to-one correlation with higher blood sugar and insulin release in the body. And a 2010 study comparing both carb and protein rich meals actually showed that when matched for overall calories, a meal higher in protein rather than higher in carbohydrates increased insulin levels more, even though blood sugar levels were lower with the higher protein meal. So even though a food may have a higher glycemic index than another, it doesn't necessarily mean it will increase insulin levels more. Secondly, even in the absence of insulin, you can still get fat. Insulin stops fat burning in the body by suppressing activity of a hormone called hormone sensitive lipase, which is, or in other words, HSL, which is an enzyme that helps break down fat in the body. But here's the kicker: if you overconsume calories, even when insulin levels are low, you'll also suppress HSL, and hence why, regardless if you follow a lower carbohydrate diet approach or not, you still need to maintain a calorie deficit if you want to lose body fat. Now, going back to the research specifically on glycemic index, most of the studies fail to equate overall calories and macronutrients in a diet, which of course will interfere with the sole question of does the GI index matter when you're comparing the two. That's just like trying to compare like the quality of a petrol on the car's performance when you're using two different cars. It just doesn't make sense. Now, there are some papers that did equate the macronutrient and fiber intake when comparing higher GI carb source and a lower GI carb source. And Sachs et al. Found that lower GI diets didn't improve insulin sensitivity, they didn't reduce triglyceride levels, nor did they have any impact on blood pressure levels. A second study by Carl and colleagues showed that there were no metabolic or fat loss advantages to lower GI diets when macronutrients and fiber were matched. Also, what does that mean for practical application? If you follow a calorie appropriate diet and you eat enough fiber in your diet, eating higher GI foods or higher GI carbohydrates will have zero detrimental effects to fat loss or overall health. So people typically think that lower GI foods are healthier. However, it's not always the case. So for example, full fat ice cream has a much lower GI index than brown rice does. So if you prefer brown bread over white bread or brown rice over white rice, then go for it, but don't be afraid to have higher GI foods in your diet, especially if it's going to help you maintain that calorie deficit. But do keep in mind that higher processed foods can be lacking in fiber and also easily overconsumed as they're often less filling. So for optimal health and fat loss goals, focus on eating whole unprocessed foods for the most part, but don't be afraid to have the foods that you enjoy some of the time, and understand that overall calories are going to be the primary driver of whether you lose fat or not. So GI index is pretty much refuted in the scientific community nowadays, and it's only ever seen online in like articles or people who don't really know what they're talking about promoting it, and it's still quite rampant in the marketing of many companies that are saying that you should eat these lower GI foods based on those theories that I just broke down that are no longer true, or they're proven not to be true. So focus again on the overall calories. If you're going to have higher GI foods in your diet, it might actually be beneficial, especially if those higher GI foods are foods that you enjoy and will help you stick to the diet. It'll help you adhere to the plan long term, because a long-term adherence is what is going to give you the overall best results, the overall goals. If you can stick to something only for a small amount of time and then you fall off the bandwagon and go back to the way you were eating before, then it's not success. But if you are having some of those higher GI foods, maybe you like candy, maybe you like eating honey or whatever it is, if you eat some of that in your diet and it helps you stick to a calorie deficit if your goal is fat loss, or if you're trying to get better health and lose fat, and if it makes you stick to that longer, well then that is actually going to be beneficial to include that in your diet. So guys, if you enjoyed the video, please leave a comment, please leave a thumbs up, and give me some feedback on what you'd like to see in the future, and I'm more than happy to try and put that into my content. Thank you guys.